Hi, this is Juliette McDaniel, author of Mr. and Mrs. American Pie, and you're listening to the Cook Memorial Library Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library Podcast. I'm your host, Nate Goss. Today on the podcast, we bring you my interview with food blogger and cookbook author Jenn Segal. Jenn is a classically trained chef who once went to culinary school and worked in fancy restaurants, but now, as a busy mom with teenagers, cooks for her family and shares all of her tested recipes on her wildly successful blog, Once Upon a Chef. Once Upon a Chef has a devoted community of regular, everyday home cooks, which she actually recruited to perfect the recipes on her first cookbook, a cookbook that came out this year also titled Once Upon a Chef. The cookbook features 100 recipes, most of which are brand new. But beyond the recipes, Jenn shares professional cooking tips such as how to balance flavors, using salt, and making the most of leftovers. With Jenn's unique and friendly writing style, it's like having a professional chef standing by your side and warmly coaching you through every recipe, teaching you the basics along the way. Now, before we jump right into my interview with Jenn, I just have to let you know that I am not kidding when I say that this is the cookbook that has gotten the most use in my home by far since its publication in April. So needless to say, Once Upon a Chef will definitely be featured in our upcoming Best of 2018 book lists that we put out every year. I do most of the cooking in my household, and to be honest, I usually approach cooking blogs a little skeptically. They can be a little bit of a mixed bag. The recipes don't always turn out, and they can be written horribly. So about 2 years ago, I was searching for some new sources for inspiration, and I stumbled on Jenn's blog. I was immediately impressed with how well the recipes were written, and also how easy it looked to make them. These were good signs, but of course what really mattered was if the recipes were any good. And let me tell you, these recipes are more than good. They are absolutely delicious. Many of Jenn's recipes have become proud members of our regular rotation, and as I make more and more of Jenn's recipes, I'm always astounded by how reliable they are. Which is why when she announced on her blog that she was publishing a cookbook, I knew I had to have it. I hope this testimony encourages you to give a few of her recipes a try. I am confident you will not be disappointed. And after sharing this little story of mine, I hope you can tell how excited I was to finally get a chance to speak with one of my biggest kitchen influences. I hope you enjoy this interview with Jenn Segal. So Jennifer Segal, thank you so much for being on the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I wanted to maybe start just with your story. From your bio on your Once Upon a Chef website, we can gather that you are professionally trained as a chef with lots of experience in fancy restaurants, and then you realized that the restaurant world wasn't for you. And then so once you married and had kids, you gladly decided to be a stay-at-home mom, and that's really how the blog and now the cookbook have developed. But I wanted to maybe back up. Where did your actual passion for cooking come from?
I first became interested in cooking when I was in college and I was studying abroad in France. It's funny, most people who go into cooking or who are really passionate about food grew up in families where food was really the focus. And my mother actually hates to cook. And, she was and still is an entrepreneur, and she worked, long hours. And so when she came home from work, she just wanted to get dinner on the table. Mm-hmm. And so that was really never a big focus in our house, and we ate out a lot. So I didn't really discover my love of cooking until I was living with a French family, and my host mother, a woman named Martine, loved to cook. And since I didn't really speak the language very well, I would spend hours and hours in the kitchen with her, just practicing the language, and I sort of learned to cook at the same time.
And so she wasn't, who you were staying with, she wasn't necessarily a trained cook. She just loved cooking and loved cooking. I'm assuming this is mostly French cuisine you were eating?
Yeah. Just she was a working mom, but she loved to cook. And, she made home-cooked meals every day. And so, it was nothing fancy, but it was just good home-cooked French food. And that's where I really learned to cook. And then I became really interested in that when I came back to Washington, D.C., where I was in college, and, just started practicing in my apartment and buying cookbooks. And as soon as I graduated college, I started to think about maybe going into food as a career. And that's when I went to culinary school.
And where exactly did you train to become a chef? And can you maybe tell us a little bit about your professional training?
Yeah. I went to a very small French culinary school in the Washington, D.C. area. It actually recently closed, sadly. But it was called L'Académie de Cuisine.
Okay.
And it's just a wonderful school. And it's a year program. You spend 6 months in the classroom, and then you do a 6-month, they call it externship, where you work in a restaurant. And I went through that program and then ended up getting a job at the restaurant that I did my externship in, which was a really wonderful, celebrated restaurant in Great Falls, Virginia, called L'Auberge Chez Francois. And it's still around and still just as good today as it was back then.
Yeah.
And,
do some of the people that you worked with, are they still there?
Yep. It's one of those restaurants where people stay forever. And
it's definitely a different world, because that's actually what you eventually realized, was that this maybe wasn't for you.
Yeah. Well, I always like to tell. So I was living at home during that time. And for the first few weeks that I worked there, I came home and just collapsed on the floor into tears, thinking, what have I gotten myself into?
Yeah.
Because it really is grueling, just physically, and I'm a small person and it's hard. It's just a lot of heavy lifting and long hours, and it's hot as heck in there. It's definitely a very hard job.
I can relate. I used to be, when I was in college, I was a server. It is definitely an intense environment, very different from a lot of what people might expect just going to work every day. This is like you're straight in, going in like straight to 11, basically.
Right.
So from your professional training, what were some of the cooking philosophies that you took from your training and that you then would apply to your blog and cookbook?
Well, French cuisine is really the basis of technique. And so I really use French technique with everything that I do still to this day. Having that foundation really helps in terms of coming up with recipes and even just cooking just sort of on my own. I use that every day. And, I think one thing that you really do learn in cooking school and working in a restaurant is you really train your palate. There's nothing like a French chef screaming at you that your food is under-seasoned to teach you how to season your food.
Sure. Yeah. I'm sure you never forget that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's just something like your husband isn't going to tell you. So you really do learn to train your palate. And it took me a long time to learn that skill. Even, when I was a year into my first job, every day before the dinner service, the chef would come around and taste everything at my station. And for the longest time, he would just take a handful of salt and throw it on my food and just tell me my food was under-seasoned. But you're so scared to oversalt that you undersalt. And so it takes a long time to sort of be comfortable with that kind of thing, taking it to that highly seasoned place. And that's really what makes restaurant food typically, what makes it so good is that it's sort of seasoned to the max. And that's when, one of the things that I do in all of my recipes is that I give precise measurements for salt, because I think that is the biggest mistake that most home cooks make, is undersalting their food.
Really?
And so, most recipes just say season to taste, but it's the salt that, if you don't have enough salt, you could make everything else in the recipe perfectly, and then it's still not going to taste good.
You were talking about how the biggest part of your training was really training your palate. I always have to wonder, when people have a really refined palate, does it make you, I guess, a little more picky in some ways?
Yeah, I guess it does. But, luckily there's salt shakers on the table and,
Yeah. So actually, I want to talk about your blog a little bit. In my experience, it seems like food blogs can actually be they're kind of a mixed bag, to be honest. Some of the blogs, they just maybe aren't written as well. The recipes are kind of like hit or miss. But I remember thinking when I saw your blog that, first of all, everything I made was reliably good, but it's also just really well written. It's easy to follow, and it has a lot of practical advice kind of thrown in there with it. I just wanted to ask you, what do you think makes a good food blog?
Gosh, well, I think there's, lots of great food blogs, and they're all different. And I sort of created the site that I was looking for. I think that there are a lot of really bad recipes out there in the world, whether it's on a food blog or if it's in a magazine or a cookbook. Yeah. I can't tell you how many recipes that I've made from places where you would think the recipes are tested and they don't work out. I mean, just last night I made a cake from a cookbook, and I should have known better. It did not look done, but it had been in the oven way past the recommended cooking time. And I cut into it and it was like lava. The whole batter came out. And I thought, somebody did not test this recipe.
Yeah.
And so for me, my blog was always about reliable recipes, because that's what I think, people were looking for. And that's what I like. I like to follow recipes, even though I don't always. I like to have a good recipe, and I like to know that I can count on recipes to work. I also think that step-by-step pictures are really great because a lot of us are visual learners, and it makes the recipe seem doable if you can see the photographs. Even though I don't think my recipes are easier than other recipes out there, people think that they're easy because I think they can visualize themselves doing it. They can look at the photo of the ingredients and say, oh, I could do that. I have that. Or I just need to get this at the store. I have everything else. It's just like you can look at it quickly. So I think photographs are important. I don't know. I think I like sources like Cooks Illustrated, where things are just tested and retested. And I like to have that assurance that things are always going to turn out. And I test my recipes 5 or 6 times before I post them on my blog, doing everything I can to sort of figure out what could go wrong. Or, I go to different stores and find different brands of ingredients, thinking, because sometimes that makes a difference.
Yeah,
sometimes I'll use one brand of tomatoes and have a different result. And so then I can sort of advise people of what roadblocks might lay ahead, or, just anything that might come up. And I also think, for me personally, I like recipe sites that have reviews. I mean, I don't know about you, but I won't make a recipe unless I can read reviews.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, that's and I actually wanted to ask about that, because that leaves a certain vulnerability for you, as far as I know when I look at something like the New York Times cooking blog, it can be brutal.
Yeah.
Your community is so nice. And I mean, it helps, I think, that your recipes are so tested, because it does provide a level of assurance for your readers. But are you ever scared about, or not, scared's not the right word, but just a little nervous about what could come when you open up the floodgates to the readers?
I am nervous every week when I post my recipe until the first reviews come in, because who knows, maybe I made a mistake, or, you just never know. I mean, cooking, there's a lot of variables. So even the most well-tested recipe, someone could have a different result. But, as soon as the first reviews start to roll in, then I can sort of take a deep sigh, deep breath. Because I do really care. Anytime you make a new recipe, you're taking a chance, and it's time consuming. You have to go to the store, you have to get the ingredients, and then that's your dinner that night. And if your family doesn't like it, you're sort of, and then what are you going to do?
Right.
But I think, most people are really nice. And if somebody does have a problem, I do go back and I look at the recipe, and I sometimes will make something again, just to be sure. There's been 1 or 2 recipes that I've actually taken off the site. Too many people have problems with them. I mean, that's one great thing about having a blog versus a cookbook is that you can change it if you need to.
Right.
If there's a problem. So.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Having those reviews makes a world of difference, because sometimes even if you don't fix it, there's a commenter that says, oh, I tried it with this, and that happens to be the one thing I did have in the kitchen, and they say it worked, and it wasn't worth it maybe for you to go fix it, but having that community really helps, even with just some of those substitutes,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And people can ask questions, and I do try to encourage people also to ask questions, and then I get back to people. That's one thing that's sort of frustrating with cookbooks. Is if you have a question, there's no one to ask. You have no way to contact the writer.
Yeah.
And so I love being able to do that.
Now, you mentioned the photography on your website. Do you do your own photography?
Yes. And it's been a learning experience. I'm still learning. I look back at pictures from my early days and I just cringe. They're so bad. But I finally this year really made a commitment to improving my photography, and I've, invested in some better equipment, and I even hired a tutor for myself.
Oh, wow.
That actually is probably the hardest part for me, is the photography.
Really?
Yeah.
Now, do you have any food photo tips, maybe for some of our Instagrammers out there who want to take better pictures of their food?
Oh gosh, I'm really not the person to ask, but natural light I always find is the prettiest. I've sort of played around with trying to use flashes and all that stuff. And now I just try and shoot during the day, when it's just the light's just right.
Well, also, I mean, it's staged well too. So maybe even like, it looks like things are plated very well. And even your dishware is very nice looking and everything. Does that make a difference, you think, in sort of getting people's attention? And
yes. I mean, the funny thing is that I actually don't think people care about the pictures. And I say that because my pictures were so bad for so long and it didn't seem to hurt me. I've probably reshot 100 recipes since the start of the year. And not one person has noticed or said a word. So, and I think they're so much better, but I don't think people really care. I think people want the recipes to work. And,
sure.
But when I was shooting the book, I didn't shoot the photos for my book. I worked with a professional food photographer and I learned so much from her. And we spent 10 days working on the book, and we had a food stylist and a prop stylist. And so at the beginning of the week, and actually every few days, this prop stylist would bring in a whole slew of props. And so it would be like linens and glassware and beautiful plates. And, she would sort of look at what we were shooting for the next few days, and she would go shopping, and the photographer had all these backgrounds. And so, it looks like a table, but it's really not a table. It's like just this big piece of wood that's painted.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, after that, I came back and I started to accumulate like prettier plates, and I got, made a few of my own backgrounds. And so that's sort of the direction I'm headed now, is really trying to be able to recreate that look, the look that my book has.
Well, it is a beautiful book, so they did a great job. I mean, the whole book. Actually, let's talk a little bit more about the book. In your introduction to your book, you say that the cookbook has been a long-time dream of yours, and you recount how this is sort of decades in the making. What is unique about a cookbook?
So the book, it really has been like a long time dream of mine. But, actually writing a book is much easier said than done. So the reason that I started my blog is because I wanted to find something that I could do from home so that I could raise my kids. And I started to think about this book again. And I actually, I talked to a lot of people in the industry. I put some feelers out there, and I quickly realized that I had zero chance of getting published as an unknown. So my little sister said to me, you should start a cooking blog. And I was like, what's a cooking blog? I had no idea what a blog even was. So she sent me some links to some popular blogs at the time. And I did a little research, and I thought, you know what, I can do this. And so I started this blog, thinking that this might be a great way to build my platform so that, I could one day go to a publisher and say, I'm not a total unknown. About 6 years into it, that's when I started working on the book. And, to be honest, at that point, I wasn't even sure that I still wanted to write a book, because really the blog is like a book. It was like, to me, it was like a living cookbook. But I, just couldn't say no, because it was something I had dreamed about for so many years. And the thing about a book, this goes back to your question, that's, different from a blog, is that, it's something that you can hold in your hands. And, it's really sort of tells a story, and the recipes are more of a collection than they are on the blog. So like there's more things that work together, and I was able to talk a lot more about my culinary background. It's just, that's more of an appropriate space for that kind of thing.
What I really like about the book is that you have these sort of helpful short remarks that are in the margins, like pro tips or, things that you have to think about before making the recipe. You've got something called sourcing savvy, which is like tips on what to buy. And my favorite actually is just even the simple idea of putting in recommendations of what sides to serve with something, with the page to find it on in your book.
Yeah.
So I've used that so many times, because I know, especially with meal planning, I'll think of what to make for dinner, and then my wife is like, well, what are we having with it?
Right.
I don't know. I didn't think about that.
I'm supposed to figure that out too?
Yeah. So were those all things that you knew you wanted in the book, or was that a suggestion from someone? And how did those ideas for those features come about?
So the heads up, which that was really important to me, because I can't tell you how many times that I've started a recipe and then I get to the end and I'm like, oh, this has to marinate for 6 hours. I wanted a place where I could warn people of what they need to be careful of. So something as simple as like when you drain the pasta, like how to remember to save some for the sauce. Save some water for the sauce. I always forget to do that. So I have, started putting a measuring cup right by my strainer. So that's
such a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Like otherwise it's 100% guaranteed that I'm going to forget. And the sourcing savvy, just giving people little tips about finding ingredients and how to pick, like really good produce. But a lot of the stuff that you see in the book, it was really a collaboration between my publisher and me and even my agent. My editor had wonderful suggestions. It was really, writing a book is such a collaborative effort. And that was also one of the things that was really fun about it. I'm so used to working by myself on my blog.
Well, and speaking of that, you kind of crowdsourced your followers for the making of the book. Hundreds of people who tested these recipes. So it's almost like the blog ethos or mentality actually did sort of trickle into this book, which it's like you took the best parts of the blog and somehow incorporated them into the book.
Yeah, I tried when I announced on the site that I was writing a book, I put out a call for recipe testers because that was one of the terrifying things about writing this book. And I sort of touched on this before when I said, there's no reviews and it's terrifying to put out this huge body of work and thinking that no one has made these recipes except for me. I worried about that. Like I wanted to make sure that the recipes were as foolproof as the ones on my blog. So I ended up with about 800 people who volunteered. Wow. And so I created this part of my blog that was password protected, where I posted the recipes as I came up with them. And I created surveys on SurveyMonkey so that they could, give their feedback. Yeah. So that was how I was able to test all the make sure that the recipes were vetted for the book. And there were definitely, a few recipes that got cut.
So what are some of your favorite recipes in the book?
Oh gosh, that's hard. Okay. Okay, so I love the recipe that's on the cover. That's one of the reasons that it's on the cover. It's an heirloom tomato and salad with burrata and pesto and pine nuts. That's one of my favorites. It sells the book,
that's for sure.
Yeah. Gosh, a couple others. I love the creamy wild mushroom soup.
Okay.
Like now that we're sort of into soup season.
Yeah.
For appetizers, and this is one that also works as an entree, the grilled beef satay with peanut sauce.
Okay.
And, that's like my favorite recipes are always the ones that my kids love too. And that's one that the kids go crazy for. Gosh, the halibut is one of my favorites.
Yeah, and I didn't have halibut, and I made that with just cod, and it was still great. Still really good.
Yeah, it's just such a simple recipe, but simple is always best.
Yeah.
Have you tried the key lime pie? That's another favorite.
No, I haven't done that one.
And it's really easy.
I love key lime pie. It's so good.
Yeah, I know. It's so good. And this one, I love this one because the crust is made with brown sugar, and that sort of makes it a little bit different. And it's just really easy.
Yeah. I know for us, what's been a big hit was you have a fiery roasted tomato basil soup. We roasted the tomatoes in the morning, and then I came home and finished it up, and it's always a hit. Even with my 2 5-year-old boys, they love it. So.
Oh, really? Oh, gosh. How do you get your kids to eat tomato soup?
Grilled cheese helps.
Right.
And I don't know. They just like it. I don't know. They also really liked, you have a buttermilk fried chicken tenders. I remember I made that, and the whole family was like, this is better than a restaurant.
That's definitely a favorite with my daughter. She loves that.
Yeah. And then the other one that was a real hit with our family was you have simple. It's open-faced bacon, avocado, and pickled onion. Which the pickled onions made such a difference.
I know. I love those pickled onions.
Yeah.
Another favorite is the granola. Have you tried the granola?
No, I haven't. Okay.
People, but there's the maple, coconut, and blueberry granola. My favorite granola I've ever made.
Huh. Yeah, and it's like granola is something that we all buy, but it seems like something that's actually not that hard to just make on your own, and seems like it makes a world of difference.
It's so much better, when you make it from scratch, and less expensive.
So I knew you were going to be on the podcast, and I asked a few of our fellow librarians and staff members to just come up with questions that they always wished they could ask a professional chef about their own home cooking. So if you don't mind, I'd like to maybe just throw a few questions out for you and see if you can kind of answer them in this sort of a lightning round kind of thing.
Okay, I'll try.
Okay, all right. One of our staff members, Libby, she says, I imagine creating recipes and writing recipes are two very different things. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach cooking differently when you know it's going to end up a written recipe? Is it harder to improvise?
It is, because you have to stop and measure every single little, and I weigh also. I weigh everything. Yeah, because I try to include metric measurements on my site as well. So, it's much different, than just winging it and cooking. It takes twice as long for sure.
And do you enjoy that, or does that sort of take some of the joy out of the cooking?
I do. That's my job. And so I like to perfect things, that kind of methodical process of creating a recipe.
All right. So, Ellen, one of our librarians, says, and you've actually already talked about this a little bit, she is saying, I'm always trying to cut down on the amount of salt I use. When do you really need salt? And more specifically, is it necessary in baking bread?
Well, I think that you need to salt for your own taste. I think once you start actually cutting out salt, your palate adjusts and you don't need as much. I noticed, my mother-in-law has to watch her salt, and she thinks everything I cook is too salty. I do think that bread needs salt, at least some salt.
Yeah.
Salt makes everything taste more like it is. Do you know what I mean? Like, it makes tomatoes taste more like tomatoes, or it makes, so I do think it's hard to leave out the salt entirely. I think when you're cooking savory foods, you can add other things to sort of add more flavor. Like maybe you add more garlic or more onions, but a little salt does go a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I remember Sami Nosrat, who wrote the Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Her chapter on salt was kind of an eye-opener to me, where she talked about what you just mentioned, which is salt just being something that brings out flavors more, not just making them salty.
I'll tell you quickly. We did this experiment. It was one of the first days in culinary school, and I write about this in the book, where the chef instructor lined up 10 bowls of chicken broth on a table, and we were told to taste each bowl of broth and find the one that was seasoned properly. And it was sort of as you expected. Like the first few bowls were bland, like dishwater, just awful, with no salt. Chicken broth tastes disgusting. And as you kept going down the line, you kept thinking, oh, this one has just the right amount of salt, until you got to the final bowl, which everyone thought would be way over salted. And it was like the perfectly seasoned bowl of broth. But, you see, like, really the salt sort of made the chicken broth taste like chicken soup. Without salt, it tasted like nothing.
Yeah.
But it also was just sort of eye-opening, seeing, how you have to sort of push it to the limit to get it to taste really good.
Yeah, it's a really good illustration. So another librarian, Haley, wants to know how you do your meal planning.
Gosh, I have to admit, I'm not a planner.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm more of like a creative type, and so I just wing it every day. I never know what I'm making for dinner. A part of it is because of what I do. I go to the store every day anyway. Okay.
Well, maybe something kind of related to that is she also asked, what are just some of your quick midweek go-to recipes?
Okay. So I have one child who's very picky. Okay. So I have to make sure that she has something good to eat at least a few nights a week, where she's not like, Mom, I don't like this. One recipe on my site that I make, I'm actually making it tonight for her birthday, is the pasta with sausage and broccoli.
Oh, we've made that. That's great. Our boys love that too.
Right? Yeah. Like, for whatever reason, kids love that. And I know, I would say 3 nights a week, I try to make something that my kids love. And then the other nights I'm trying out things and making them taste new stuff. My kids love my chicken tacos, like stuff like chili I'll make, and just have that also in the freezer for those nights where everybody's running around.
Yeah.
I have a recipe for these 30-minute Asian beef bowls. Those are really easy and really good. My kids love it. I seem to make things with ground meat for my kids. It seems like everything, Yeah, like meatballs, that kind of stuff. And that stuff you can throw together in 30 minutes and dinner's done.
Haley was also curious, what was one of your biggest failures in the kitchen? Hers was a vegan meatloaf that forever grounded her from making anything close to that ever again.
Gosh, my biggest failure in the kitchen. I'm at the point now where I don't have like huge cooking flops, just because I cook so much every day. I can usually anticipate that.
Salvage it into something.
Yeah. Although the cake that I made the other night, that when I cut into it, all the batter oozed out, would probably qualify. Huh. I do things like just being careless, like dropping something when I take it out of the oven, and it's all over the floor. Yeah. That stuff I do when I'm distracted.
Uh-huh. Okay, and then I just had a few quick questions, one of which was, I seem to get really discouraged by how much food I end up throwing away when I clean our fridge. Do you have any secrets or tips on just being less wasteful in the kitchen?
It's hard. I do try to, repurpose leftovers. So, if we have chicken one night, I might turn it into fried rice the next night, so just trying to be creative about how you use leftovers. I find that nobody really wants to eat leftovers in their original form. And I also, try and eat stuff for lunch the next day.
Good. Those are good tips. And then the other one is, it is November now, so Thanksgiving is coming up. And I know our listeners, especially maybe some of us who are hosting, could really use some pro tips for the big feast. Are you hosting this year?
I host every year.
You host every okay.
Yeah, Thanksgiving's my big event. It's my Super Bowl. For Thanksgiving, I think the key is to keep it simple. And the main thing I think to keep simple is the turkey. Please do not stress out over your turkey, because turkey is never good. No matter what you do to it, it's never that good. So don't worry about it. I have a very simple recipe. It's a 2-hour turkey. You roast it in a high heat oven. You have to make sure that you don't smoke up your house. Mm-hmm. But it's the easiest recipe, and I think it comes out the best, and you don't have to do anything crazy to your turkey, like brine it for 5 days or, turning it all different ways in the oven. And, I think people get really obsessed with the turkey, and it's the least delicious part of the meal, no matter what you do to it. So I think people should focus on, making some great sides and some great desserts, because that's what everybody really looks forward to. And you can even do your turkey ahead of time. I have done that too. It doesn't need to be presented as this big bird at the table. You can cook it ahead of time, slice it ahead of time. And I think anything that takes the pressure off. I have learned that over the years. When I first started hosting Thanksgiving, I did way too much. And by the time we sat down to dinner, I was practically falling asleep at the table. So I think keep it simple.
Yeah. Do you have any recipes in your book, speaking of sides, that you think would just be absolute winners on Thanksgiving?
I have a couple. So there's a wild rice salad in the book with an orange vinaigrette. It's made with pecans and cranberries. It's perfect for Thanksgiving. You can do it ahead of time. And it's also the kind of thing that doesn't need to be served hot. And I also have a great Brussels sprout recipe in the book that would be good for Thanksgiving. Yeah. They're made on the stovetop. So again, you don't have to worry about oven space.
Okay, so we always like to throw out to our author interviews as the last question, just what have you been reading lately? But I also want to ask, in addition to that for you, what are some of your favorite cookbooks?
Okay. What I've been reading lately actually are cookbooks, because I just got Dory Greenspan's new book, and I love her. It's wonderful and would make a great holiday gift.
They do make great holiday gifts, cookbooks do. So.
Yeah, and her new book, I think it's Everyday Dory, I think that's what it's called, but it's beautiful. And I already made something from it, and it came out great, of course. And she's just a wonderful author. She's one of my favorites. And I actually I guess I'm late to the party. I bought the book that you mentioned before, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, because I just watched that on
Netflix show? Yeah.
And I loved it. And I'd heard about that book, and I don't know why I just hadn't picked it up. And I just started reading that. That's more textbook style.
It is. It's more about teaching, kind of more probably what you learned in school, but a lot of us never got the benefit of,
Exactly. But that's what I'm reading right now, both of those books, and cooking from. I haven't made anything from hers yet, that's next on my list. She's got a buttermilk chicken in that book that looks delicious, and she makes it on the show.
She has in there a recipe for like a really low temperature salmon that she does in the oven with herbs. And that's now my kind of go-to way to do salmon. I think it's really
I'll have
brilliant.
to try that.
Yeah. I recommend that book too, actually. All right. Well, Jenn Segal, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on our podcast and share some of your cooking experience, cooking tips, and thank you for writing such a delicious blog and cookbook.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed that interview. I hope it gave you some inspiration for cooking and also made you really want to go check out Jenn's recipes on her blog, onceuponachef.com. And if you'd like to check out the cookbook, which I highly recommend, we do have it available at the library. Head on over to our website, cooklib.org, and search the catalog for Once Upon a Chef, or you can just click the link in our show notes. I have a feeling that after you've made 1 or 2 recipes from the book, you're going to want to have it handy in your kitchen all the time. While you're over at our website, don't forget to also visit our blog, Shelf Life. It's a great place to go find out what our librarians have been reading lately and what they've been into, along with some really great local history stories, genealogy tips, and a whole lot more. That blog can be found at shelflife.cooklib.org. Remember, you can talk to us anytime. You can catch us on Twitter at Cook Library or send any of your feedback or messages or questions or whatever you want about the podcast to webmaster@cooklib.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and let them know that they can catch future episodes of the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast just by subscribing in Apple Podcasts or anywhere that they like to get their podcasts. We will be back soon, but until then, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.